People worldwide are celebrating Nelson Mandela Day today, especially in South Africa, where he fought to end extreme racial segregation. Today would have been his 100th birthday. But now some young South Africans are questioning Mandela's legacy. CBS News foreign correspondent Debora Patta spoke with a few of these young people to find out why they believe Mandela didn't do enough.
They are called the Born Frees, born after Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president, free after decades of racist rule. Yet for many of them, Mandela's dream of a rainbow nation has been a bitter disappointment. 24 years into South Africa's democracy, more than half the population still lives in abject poverty.
It is a myth, and you know, we are bearing the brunt of that because we grew up with this fallacy of this new South Africa, this place that's going to let us dream and be whoever we are. But now, as young adults, we are being blocked at every turn, you know.
Jabu Simelani's mother works as a cleaning lady in one of Johannesburg's most affluent suburbs. He grew up in this tiny room, but found a way out of poverty because in an extraordinary act of generosity, his mother's employer paid for him to get a decent education. Most people, he says, are not so lucky.
White people hold the power in South Africa, though it's mainly white male dominant, you know, and even though politically there's a whole lot of black faces, the true power, the economy is still run by white people.
Like everyone here, Simelani received a scholarship to study at this institution, the Umuzi Academy, which trains young people in the skills needed for high-valued jobs. Simelani and his friends know Umuzi will make a dramatic difference in their lives, but they say ongoing education should be a basic right, not luck. But for most South Africans, university is unaffordable, and they blame Nelson Mandela.
I don't think I'm angry. I think I'm very disappointed. You know, like I think that's like the feeling. I feel like they could have done more for me as a person.
They
being
Nelson Mandela.
Nelson Mandela, the ANC, the people that got us our freedom. You know, they could have done better for us. Nelson Mandela himself
Could have got a better deal.
Could have got a better deal.
It's a growing South African narrative amongst young people that Mandela and his colleagues sold them out by only obtaining political and not economic freedom.
What's the point of getting VIP access if you're not going to get the VIP benefits? You know, it's like you're an honorary white person. It's like, come through, chill with us, but you're not going to do the same things that we do. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're going to get into the party, but you're not going to take a picture with Beyonce type of thing.
But for those who were close to Mandela, like Jay Naidu, who was in his first cabinet, the fault lies not with Mandela, but the leadership that followed him.
I think he would have understood the anger. He would have understood the anger and accepted it. I think his disappointment is not in the young people. His disappointment is in the leadership.
Naidu says Mandela showed South Africa the way, but it is up to this country to live up to his democratic values.
We would be aghast at the thought that we are venerating him, beatifying him. We are putting him in a museum and hanging him up like the Mona Lisa smiling down from the walls of the Louvre. What we have to do is find the Mandela within us.
Debora Patta is with me now from Johannesburg, South Africa, to talk a little bit more about this. And, you know, Debora, Nelson Mandela was really applauded for the way he was able to marshal his country forward after the end of segregation. The Truth and Reconciliation committees allowed South Africans of all colors to have an open dialogue, and he was very well aware of the fact that important steps needed to occur, but also in some ways baby steps to make sure that the country didn't sort of fall apart. But now it seems, at least for some of the young people that you spoke to, some of those steps were too small, that some things were left on the table, weren't negotiated, that needed to be taken care of. Do they have a legitimate argument? Did Nelson Mandela maybe ignore certain important things in order to get other things rolling in South Africa?
Well, here's the thing, Anne-Marie, is that in the 24 years since Nelson Mandela was president, the first black president after spending 27 years in jail, there has been significant change. Black South Africans have the vote. Racism is now illegal in South Africa, and in many areas there's been significant social upliftment. But what young black South Africans are saying is that that is not enough. They expected things to be much further down the road, and the truth is that half this country still lives in poverty. Unemployment is rampant. It sits at around 27%. That's the official statistic. Unofficially, it is much higher. We are battling here in this country with terrible racial and economic injustices that still need to be addressed in some way. And so for a young person like Jabu Simelane, he looks at his mother, who is basically still cleaning the home of an affluent person in a white suburb, mainly white suburb. Black people are now allowed to live there, so there's no forced segregation. And he's saying, what has changed? Most significant of all, though, is education. And I think that's been the biggest failing of South Africa's fledgling democracy, is that whilst the education is free, it's not equal. So if you are living in a rural black area, you can go to school for free, but the quality of the education will be very poor. There may not be textbooks. The teachers may not be the best teachers. You won't have access to resources. So if you go to school in an affluent area, that's far better. And imagine you get that far, and then there's still university, which is incredibly expensive in South Africa and unaffordable for the majority of South Africans. So you're seeing these young black kids coming out of school, they drop out of university because they can't afford it, they can't get jobs, and then they become very disillusioned. But to blame it on Nelson Mandela, the anger may be justified, but I think that is a stretch too far. Bear in mind, this country lived through nearly a decade of rule under President Jacob Zuma, who was forced to resign last year. He was exceptionally corrupt. He has hundreds, literally hundreds, over 700 corruption charges still facing him. He will go to court later this year. He used money to upgrade his personal home. That's taxpayers' money. He essentially sold this country to what's been described as a criminal mafia that got favorable tenders in order to enrich themselves. And that is the situation that we're facing in the country, that a decade of that has set this country back. Mandela, on the other hand, if you look at the historical circumstances, came out of prison and there could have been bloodshed here. This country was ripe for racial war, civil war, ethnic war. He avoided that. His genius was for political persuasion, for turning his captor essentially into his comrade. Anne-Marie?
So I want to ask you just one more quick question. You know, yesterday Barack Obama spoke in light of these celebrations here. He didn't specifically address President Trump, but some felt they were sort of veiled references to him. I want to play a little bit of his speech.
People just make stuff up. They just make stuff up. We see it in the growth of state-sponsored propaganda. We see it in internet-driven fabrications. We see it in the blurring of lines between news and entertainment. We see the utter loss of shame among political leaders where they're caught in a lie and they just double down and they lie some more. It used to, look, let me say, politicians have always lied. But it used to be if you caught them lying, they'd be like, oh, man. Now they just keep on lying.
Just curious, any reaction to that speech there in South Africa?
Well, I think people are interpreting it as not even a thinly veiled swipe against Trump, a swipe against Trump. It was hard to listen to that speech without referencing the Trump presidency and what that would mean. I mean, for example, the current debate that is going on about what Trump did or didn't say about Russia meddling in US elections. And what Obama spoke about was that strongman politics are on the ascendant, that the politics of fear and resentment are at play. And South Africans broadly took that to mean that he was referring to President Trump, and that if you're going to invoke the Mandela legacy, it needs to be the opposite of that, because nobody is born, Obama said, quoting Mandela, hating another person, that love comes more naturally to the human heart. And essentially, that was Obama's appeal to the young generation, that they should
fight to uphold democracy and not be complacent about it. He said it's sad that he has to remind people today about that, but that is the reality of the current political scenario. He also used the speech for very indirect attacks on some of Trump's key policies: immigration, climate change, trade tariffs. So whilst he never mentioned Trump by name throughout the entire speech, he was always there really as a point of reference.
Debora Patta for us in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you so much, Debora.